The air in the small, damp cottage tasted of wood smoke and fear. It was a taste Elena had grown accustomed to over 5 years, a constant seasoning on her tongue. Outside, the perpetual twilight of the Blackwood pressed in, its ancient trees like silent, skeletal sentinels guarding the approach to the vampire capital of Noctis. 6 days now they had been this close enough for the city's oppressive energy to seep into the soil and hum up through the floorboards. Close enough to be a mistake. Elena ran a hand over her daughter's hair, the strands a silken fall of spun moonlight, so like his. Lily was asleep, her small chest rising and falling in the steady, untroubled rhythm of childhood. One of her hands was curled around a carved wooden wolf, its features worn smooth by her constant touch. A pang, sharp and familiar, went through Elena. She had carved it for her, a clumsy replica of the silver signet ring he had worn. A foolish, sentimental act that could get them both killed. 5 years. It felt like a lifetime and a breath. The memory of him was a wound that had never properly healed, a phantom warmth against her skin on the coldest nights. Alaric. His name was a secret prayer she never dared to speak aloud. She remembered the fire in his obsidian eyes, the astonishing gentleness in his hands that could sunder stone but had traced the line of her jaw as if she were the most fragile thing in the world. He had been dying, the venom of a rival's blade a black frost creeping through his veins. She, a human healer living on the fringes of his domain, had been his last resort. For a week, she had fought the poison, her knowledge of herbs and poultices a desperate shield against the encroaching dark. And in that crucible of fever and fear, something else had been forged. A connection so fierce and immediate it had left her breathless. He had looked at her, truly seen her, in a way no one ever had. In the quiet hours when the fever broke, when life had flooded back into him, they had fallen together, a collision of desperation and gratitude and a loneliness neither had known how to name. When she realized she was with child, terror had been a cold hand squeezing her heart. She knew the law. The progenitor's decree was etched in blood and stone. A half-breed was an abomination, a dilution of the sacred bloodline. Such a child was to be unmade upon discovery, its human parent with it. There was no mercy in their law, no room for a love like theirs. Alaric, for all his power, was bound by it. To reveal her secret would have been to force him to choose between his throne and a child the world would see as a monster. It would have been his ruin. And so, she had fled. She had run with nothing but the clothes on her back and the impossible secret growing within her, leaving behind the only man she had ever loved to save the life of his daughter. A floorboard creaked in the other room. Elena froze, every muscle tensing. Lily stirred in her sleep, a soft murmur escaping her lips. For 5 years, they had moved like ghosts, from remote villages to forgotten forest shacks, always one step ahead of the whispers, the rumors of a human woman with a child whose eyes held the uncanny light of the eternal night. But Lily was growing. Her senses, a strange and potent mix of human and vampire, were sharpening. She could hear a mouse's heartbeat from across a field and see in the pitch dark. And she was filled with a boundless, terrifying curiosity about the world, a world Elena had to deny her. A world that included the father she had never known. "Mama." Lily's voice was a sleepy whisper from the cot. "Is the sun coming soon?" Elena's heart ached. "No, little wolf." Not for a while. She smoothed her daughter's hair back again. "Go back to sleep." Lily's eyes, Alaric's eyes, blinked open, luminous in the gloom. "I had a dream," she said, her voice small but clear. "About the big castle. The one you told me not to go near. There were shiny lights and music. And a man on a big chair." He looked sad. A cold dread washed over Elena. It was just a dream, my love, but she knew it wasn't. Lily's dreams were often more than dreams. They were echoes, whispers on a current of blood and magic that connected her to her father, to the heart of the vampire world. This was why they had to leave. This proximity was making the connection stronger, a beacon in the dark. "He felt like you," Lily murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. "Like home." Elena swallowed against the lump in her throat. She sat by the cot for a long time, watching her daughter breathe, the fierce, protective love she felt for her a physical weight in her chest. Tomorrow, she vowed. At first light, they would be gone. They would disappear so deep into the human lands that not even a king's magic could find them. But when she finally rose, stiffness in her limbs, and turned to check the wards on the door, she found it slightly ajar. A sliver of cold night air sliced into the room. Her gaze snapped back to the cot. It was empty. The little wooden wolf lay abandoned on the pillow. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. It stole her breath, turned the blood in her veins to ice. She stumbled outside, her bare feet sinking into the cold, damp earth. The woods were unnervingly silent. There was no sign of her, no footprint, no snapped twig. But she could feel it. A faint, pulling sensation in the air, a thread of energy leading toward the distant, malevolent glow of Noctis. Lily, drawn by a dream of her father, had gone to find him. Elena began to run, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs, each beat a name, Alaric. The great hall of the Onyx Keep was a cavern of obsidian and frozen silence. Centuries of power had been consolidated within these walls, witnessed by tapestries that depicted the bloody ascensions of Alaric's ancestors. The air was heavy with the scent of cold stone, beeswax, and the metallic tang of unspoken threat. Alaric sat upon the throne of ashes, a seat carved from the heart of a petrified godwood tree, its surface cool and unyielding beneath his hands. Before him, the gathered lords of the great houses stood like a pack of circling wolves, their fine silks and velvets failing to conceal the predatory tension in their postures. The challenge had been coming for months, a slow-gathering storm on the political horizon. Now, it had broken. Lord Volkov, his face a mask of aristocratic disdain, his silver hair a stark slash against his black tunic, was the storm's heart. His house had always resented Alaric's rule, viewing his reign as a temporary inconvenience before their own inevitable rise. The Western territories languish, Volkov's voice was a silken blade, slicing through the hall's oppressive quiet. The human incursions on the border go unchecked. Your reign, Lord Alaric, has been marked by a regrettable softness. The bloodline weakens under such placid leadership. Alaric listened, his expression impassive. He let the silence that followed Volkov's accusation stretch, letting the weight of it press down on the challenger. He could feel the eyes of the council on him, the ancient, calculating vampires who had seen kings rise and fall like the turning of seasons. They were vultures, waiting to see which way the battle would turn before descending. Softness, Lord Volkov. Alaric's voice was low, yet it filled the vast hall with ease, a resonant bass that vibrated in the very stone. Or is it stability you mistake for weakness? Our granaries are full. Our borders have been quiet for 2 decades under my watch. Perhaps your taste for chaos has dulled your memory of what true weakness brings: civil war, famine, and pyres of our own kind. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze pinning Volkov in place. You speak of strength. Let us speak of it. Your house bleeds its coffers on lavish parties while your conscripts starve. You posture and preen, but you have not won a single significant battle in your 100 years. You are a peacock, my lord, rattling feathers to distract from an empty mind. A murmur went through the assembled lords. A direct insult, a glove thrown down. Volkov's face tightened, a flicker of raw fury in his pale eyes before it was sheathed again in cold arrogance. Your insults are as dull as your reign. The law is clear. I find your leadership wanting. I challenge your right to sit the throne of ashes. By the ancient rights, by the lex sanguinis, I demand a vote of no confidence from the council. Should they find in my favor, I will meet you in the circle of judgment. It was the formal declaration. The final move in a game that had been played in shadows for years. Alaric felt a familiar weariness settle over him. He had fought for this throne. He had bled for it. He had spent a century securing it, not for ambition, but because he believed he could build a better, more stable world for his people. A world free from the petty, bloody squabbles of men like Volkov. He had sacrificed everything. He had even let the only warmth he had ever known slip through his fingers, all for the sake of this cold, lonely duty. Elena. Her name was a ghost on his heart. He had searched for her for a year after she'd vanished, his best trackers returning with nothing but whispers and dead ends. He had eventually accepted that she, a mortal woman, had been frightened by his world and had chosen to return to her own. The pain of it had been honed to a fine, sharp point he carried with him always. He was about to respond, to accept the challenge with the cold finality it deserved, when he felt it. A small, tentative tug on the hem of his heavy ceremonial cape, which pulled on the dais around the throne. It was a sensation so alien in this place of rigid formality that for a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. He glanced down. Peeking out from behind the massive, carved leg of the throne was a child. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, with a wild tangle of dark hair and eyes so wide and luminous they seemed to drink the torchlight. She was dressed in a simple, homespun tunic, smudged with dirt, and she clutched a worn wooden wolf in one small hand. For a heartbeat, the entire hall, with its scheming lords and ancient protocols, simply ceased to exist. There was only this impossible, tiny creature who had somehow slipped past the royal guard, past the council, past 100 wary vampires, to arrive at the foot of his throne. Her gaze was fixed on him, a look of profound, unwavering curiosity. There was no fear in her eyes, only a sort of solemn recognition. The silence in the hall was now absolute, a heavy, breathless thing. Every vampire present had frozen, their attention locked on the child. Volkov's mouth was half open, his challenge forgotten. The little girl took a hesitant step forward, her small hand still tangled in the velvet of his cape. She tilted her head, her dark hair falling across her shoulder to reveal the delicate shell of her ear. And then, in a voice that was small but carried with unnerving clarity in the cathedral-like silence, she asked a single, world-shattering question. "Daddy." The word, so soft, so innocent, struck the great hall like a thunderclap. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The assembled lords of Noctis, beings of immense age and power, were frozen in a state of collective, silent shock. The single word hung in the air, an impossible jewel of sound in a cavern of stunned silence. Alaric felt it land in his chest not as a sound, but as a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, stopping the slow, steady beat of his vampiric heart. Daddy. The absurdity of it was his first thought. A mistake. A lost human child who had wandered in from the city, mistaking him for someone else. It was the only logical explanation. But then his eyes, accustomed to discerning the most subtle of details, truly took in the child before him. He saw the precise curve of her jawline, a delicate echo of his own. He saw the way her dark, almost black hair held faint, coppery glints under the torchlight, the exact shade of the woman who had haunted his memories for 5 agonizing years. Elena. And her eyes were his. They were the same deep, obsidian black, holding the same faint, silvered light at their core, a trait unique to his bloodline, the line of the progenitors. It was impossible. It was a fever dream. A hallucination brought on by the stress of the challenge. Just as his mind was scrambling for a rational explanation, a frantic movement at the edge of the hall shattered the tableau. Lily. The voice was a choked, desperate cry. Elena. She burst through the massive doors, her face pale with terror, her simple dress torn at the hem from running. Her eyes, wide with a horror that was soul-deep, were locked on her daughter. On Lily, who stood at the foot of the throne, her hand still resting on Alaric's cape. When Elena's gaze lifted and met his, the world tilted on its axis. The 5 years of her absence, the cold ache of his loss, the carefully constructed walls around his heart, they all crumbled to dust in that single, shattering look. In her eyes, he saw it all, her fear, her desperation, and the terrible, undeniable truth. His gaze dropped back to the child. Lily. His mind replayed her name, spoken in Elena's frantic cry. He looked at the girl's face, this tiny being who was a perfect, impossible fusion of himself and the woman he had never stopped loving. The logic was undeniable, a brutal equation of biology and memory. The week they had spent together. The timing. Her disappearance. It all clicked into place with the sickening finality of a tomb door swinging shut. This was his daughter. At the exact moment the realization solidified in his mind, something ancient and powerful stirred within the very foundations of the keep. A deep, resonant thrum of energy pulsed up from the stone beneath his throne, a wave of palpable magic that washed through the hall. The throne of ashes, which had been cold and inert for his entire reign, suddenly felt warm against his back. A faint, silvery light emanated from the ancient runes carved into its arms, illuminating the child at its base. She was bathed in its glow, and she did not flinch. Instead, she looked up at him, a small, trusting smile gracing her lips. The blood oath. Alaric's breath hitched. It was a legend, a piece of lore so old most believed it was mere metaphor. The throne was not just a seat of power, it was a sentient magical artifact, bound to the progenitor bloodline. It was said that should a true heir of the ruling line, one unrecognized by law but confirmed by blood, present themselves, the throne itself would awaken to acknowledge them. It was a failsafe, a way for the magic of the kingdom to protect its lineage. And this child, his child, had just triggered it. Her innocent presence, her claim of daddy, had been recognized by the oldest magic in the land. She was now bound to the throne, and the throne to her. A collective gasp went through the hall as the lords felt the pulse of magic. They recognized it for what it was. Lord Volkov, his shock finally giving way to a triumphant, predatory gleam, was the first to find his voice. An abomination, he hissed, the words dripping with venom. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Lily, a half-breed, standing on the hallowed dais of the progenitors. His voice rose, filled with righteous fury, aimed not at Alaric, but at the wavering council members. Behold the softness of our king, he has consorted with human filth. He has sired a mongrel and allowed it to defile this sacred hall. The law is absolute. The progenitor's decree is clear. He turned his burning gaze on Alaric, his face a mask of cruel victory. He had been handed a weapon more powerful than any army. The child must be destroyed. Now. As the law demands. Or you, Alaric, can declare your allegiance to this thing. He spat the word. Reject the law, and you reject the throne. The magic that has just acknowledged her will recoil from a king who breaks its most sacred tenets. You will be king no more. The choice is yours. Your crown, or your abomination. The ultimatum hung in the air, as sharp and cold as a headsman's axe. The entire room held its breath, waiting. Elena stood frozen by the doors, tears streaming silently down her face, her body trembling with a terror so profound it was a physical force. Lily, sensing the shift in the room, the sudden wave of malice directed at her, finally looked uncertain. Her smile faltered, and she took a small step back, pressing herself against Alaric's leg. Her small hand, which had been resting on his cape, now clutched it, seeking protection. And Alaric, the king of Noctis, felt that small, desperate grip through the heavy velvet, a tiny anchor in a world that had just been torn apart. He looked from the snarling face of his enemy to the terrified eyes of his lover, and finally down to the face of the daughter he had never known he had. Lord Volkov's words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the hall. Your crown, or your abomination. The choice was laid bare, a gleaming, cruel trap. Every lord, every council member, every guard, waited for his answer. Alaric could feel their collective will pressing in on him, the weight of 1,000 years of unbroken law, of prejudice hardened into scripture. The progenitor's decree was the bedrock of their society, the first lesson every vampire child learned: our blood is sacred, our line is pure. To dilute it is the greatest heresy. He had upheld that law. He had passed judgment on others who had broken it, his voice cold and remote as he condemned them, never imagining the sheer, soul-crushing hypocrisy he would one day face. He looked at Lord Volkov, at the undisguised triumph in the man's eyes. Volkov believed he had already won. To reject the child would be to show a weakness so profound, a willingness to sacrifice his own blood for power, that the council would abandon him. To accept her would be to break the sacred law, an act of treason against their entire history, which would force the council to depose him. It was a perfect political checkmate. But Volkov, in his arrogance, had miscalculated. He saw the situation as a political problem. He could not, understand what was happening inside Alaric. For a century, Alaric had been a king, a ruler, a symbol. He had forgotten, perhaps, how to be a man. But in the space of a few heartbeats, that had changed. The sight of Elena, her face a canvas of love and terror, had reignited a part of him he thought long dead. And the feeling of his daughter's small hand clutching his cape, it was a revelation. It was not the touch of an abomination. It was the touch of his child. His gaze swept over the hall, over the hard, expectant faces of his court. He saw the rigid adherence to tradition, the fear of change, the cold comfort of dogma. They were all trapped in the past, shackled to the words of long-dead ancestors who had never conceived of a moment like this. For centuries, his people had defined themselves by their purity, by what they were not human, not mortal, not weak. But what, then, were they? Lonely, stagnant beings, clinging to a brittle definition of strength while their hearts turned to dust. He looked at Elena, a silent question in his eyes. Her own gaze was filled with a terrible, pleading despair. She expected him to choose the throne. She had run from him 5 years ago precisely because she believed he would have to, that the law would give him no other option. She had tried to save him from this impossible choice, and in doing so, had borne the entire burden of their love, their daughter, alone. The depth of her sacrifice, her strength, humbled him. Finally, his eyes returned to Lily. She was no longer looking at him with curiosity, but with a dawning fear. She could feel the hostility of the room, a palpable, crushing wave of it directed at her. Her lower lip trembled. She was just a child, caught in a storm she could not comprehend. She was not a political pawn. She was not a legal problem. She was his daughter. And he was her father. It was the simplest, most profound truth in the world. The choice, which to Volkov had seemed so impossible, was no choice at all. What was a crown made of cold metal and lonely duty compared to the warmth of this small hand? What was a kingdom of stone and shadow compared to the light in this child's eyes? He had been a king for 100 years. He had been a father for 5 minutes. And in those 5 minutes, he had discovered a strength he never knew he possessed, not the strength to rule, but the strength to protect. Slowly, deliberately, Alaric moved. He did not speak. Words were for politicians like Volkov. An act, a single, irrefutable act, was what this moment required. He rose from the throne of ashes, the ancient wood groaning softly. The hall held its collective breath. He stepped down from the dais, his heavy cape sweeping behind him. He walked past the petrified form of Lord Volkov, his eyes never leaving the two people who had just shattered his world and rebuilt it anew. He walked toward Elena, his steps steady and sure. The guards tensed, but did not move. He stopped directly in front of his daughter. Lily looked up at him, her fearful eyes searching his. He saw his own face reflected in them, and for the first time, he did not see a king. He saw a father. And then, he did something no one in that hall had ever seen him do, something no progenitor king had done in recorded history. He knelt. He lowered himself onto the cold obsidian floor, bringing himself down to her level, until they were eye to eye. He reached out, his hand a hand that had wielded a sword in 100 battles, shaking almost imperceptibly. He gently, tenderly, brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. Her skin was warm, alive. "Hello, little one," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I am Alaric. It seems. I am your father." He glanced up at Elena, his heart in his eyes. "And I have been a fool." Then he looked back at Lily, and a genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. "I am so very glad to meet you." He scooped her up into his arms. She was so small, so light. She hesitated for a moment, then wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, burying her face in the crook of his shoulder, her fear finally giving way to a child's instinct for safety. He held her close, the scent of rain and wild herbs from her hair filling his senses. He stood, his daughter held securely in his arms, and turned to face the stunned court. His choice was made. And it was holding him as tightly as he was holding her. The silence that followed Alaric's actions was of a different quality than before. The shock had curdled into a dangerous, volatile mixture of disbelief and outrage. By kneeling, by embracing the child, Alaric had not just defied the law, he had shattered the very image of his office. Kings did not kneel, especially not to a creature deemed an abomination. Lord Volkov was the first to recover, his face contorted in a sneer of righteous fury. "Treason," he roared, the word echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. He embraces the half-breed. He forsakes his crown, his people, his very blood. He is no longer fit to rule. Cries of agreement rose from his supporters, a discordant, angry chorus. He defies the progenitors. The law is broken. Seize the traitor. The royal guard, who had been standing like statues, shifted uneasily, their hands moving to the hilts of their swords. Their loyalty was to the throne, but the man who occupied it had just committed the ultimate sacrilege. They looked to their captain, a grim, ancient vampire named Marcus, whose face was an unreadable mask of granite. Alaric ignored the rising chaos. His focus was entirely on the small, warm weight in his arms and the terrified woman standing a few feet away. He walked to Elena's side, his body a shield between her and the hostile court. He reached out his free hand and took hers. Her hand was cold as ice, trembling violently, but she gripped his with a desperate strength. "I am sorry, Elena," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone. "I am sorry for the fear you have lived with. I am sorry I was not there." Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head. "Alaric, they will kill you. You cannot do this." "They can try," he said, his voice a low growl of absolute certainty. He squeezed her hand, then turned to face the seething assembly, his daughter still held protectively against his chest. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting a tone of command that cut through the din like a razor. "Silence." The sheer, unadulterated power in that single word was enough to quell the uproar. The guards froze. The lords fell quiet. All eyes were on him, the king who had seemingly lost his mind. "Lord Volkov accuses me of treason," Alaric began, his voice cold and clear. "He speaks of law, of tradition. But he speaks only of the laws that suit his ambition. He has forgotten the oldest law, the one upon which all others are built." He shifted Lily slightly in his arms, so the court could see her face, nestled against his shoulder. "He calls this child an abomination. I call her my daughter, my blood. And the throne," he gestured with his head toward the glowing seat behind him, "agrees. You all felt it. The magic of the progenitors has acknowledged her. It has bound her to the heart of this kingdom. Are you so arrogant, Lord Volkov, to believe your interpretation of the law is superior to the judgment of the throne itself?" Volkov paled slightly but recovered quickly. "A magical anomaly. The presence of tainted blood has confused the artifact. The law is written in stone, not in fleeting pulses of energy. The decree is absolute. Laws are written by men and vampires," Alaric countered, his gaze sweeping the room. "They are tools, not gods. They are meant to serve us, to bring order and justice. When a law ceases to do that, when it demands the murder of an innocent child, it is no longer a law. It is a tyranny. And I will not be its instrument." He looked directly at Volkov, his eyes blazing with cold fire. "You have challenged my right to rule. You have demanded a vote of no confidence. You have demanded a trial in the circle of judgment." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "I will do you one better. I will not subject my daughter's right to exist to the whims of a political vote. Her life is not a matter for debate." He took a deep breath, and his voice boomed with ancient, formal power. "I, Alaric, of the line of Cassian, rightful king of Noctis, invoke the lex sanguinis, the law of blood. Not your corrupted interpretation, Volkov, but the original right. The trial by combat for proclamation. I declare this child, Lily, to be my legitimate heir. I proclaim that the old law is unjust and dead. The new law is this: any child of the bloodline, regardless of their heritage, is a child of the kingdom. This I proclaim." A wave of shocked murmurs swept the hall. This was an invocation of a power so ancient it had not been used in millennia. It was a king's ultimate prerogative, to declare a new law and defend it not with debate, but with steel. "By the old ways," Alaric continued, his voice resonating with power, "any who dispute this proclamation may challenge me. Not for my throne, but for the truth of my words. Defeat me, and my proclamation dies with me. But if I stand when all challengers have fallen, my word becomes law, etched into the magic of this kingdom for all time. My daughter will be recognized. My heir will be secure. He leveled a deadly gaze at Volkov, and then at every other lord in the room. So, who among you disputes me? Who wishes to test their conviction against my own? Step forward. The circle of judgment awaits. He had turned their political trap into a crucible of blood. He was no longer defending his crown, he was fighting for the soul of his kingdom, for his daughter's future. He strode toward the center of the hall, toward the inlaid silver circle that marked the space for formal duels, never letting go of Elena's hand. The court parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, their faces a mixture of fear, awe, and bloodthirsty anticipation. He had made his choice. Now, he would pay for it in blood. The air in the great hall grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of violence. The lords and ladies of the court retreated to the edges of the room, their fine silks rustling as they formed a living wall around the circle of judgment. Torches were brought in, casting flickering, dancing shadows that made the central silver circle gleam like a freshly drawn blade. Alaric gently passed Lily into Elena's arms. The child was trembling, her wide eyes fixed on her father's face. "It will be all right," he murmured, his voice soft, for her alone. He cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her soft skin. "No one will ever harm you. I promise." He looked at Elena, and the weight of 1,000 unsaid things passed between them. Her face was a mask of sheer terror, not for herself, but for him. "Alaric, you don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can run. We can disappear." He gave her a sad, gentle smile. "Where would we run, Elena? To a world that would hunt her for being part vampire? Here, she is hunted for being part human. There is no place for her in the world as it is. So, I will make a place for her." He leaned in and pressed a chaste, firm kiss to her forehead. "Stay behind Marcus and the guard. They will protect you." He turned to the captain of his guard. Marcus, who had been watching with an impassive face, gave a single, sharp nod. His loyalty, it seemed, was to the man, not just the office. He and a dozen of his most elite guards formed a protective cordon around Elena and Lily, their backs to the court, their spears leveled outward. It was a silent, powerful statement of allegiance. Alaric shrugged off his heavy ceremonial cape, letting it fall to the floor in a pool of black velvet. Beneath, he wore a simple black tunic and trousers, practical and unadorned. He didn't call for armor. This was not a battle of war, it was a trial of conviction. He rolled his shoulders, the muscles in his back and arms flexing, and drew the sword that was his constant companion. It was a simple blade of unadorned vampiric steel, dark and matte, forged to never rust or dull. It made no sound as it left its scabbard. He stepped into the center of the silver circle and waited. Lord Volkov, his face a thunderous mask of fury at this turn of events, did not step forward himself. He was a politician, not a warrior. But he had warriors who owed him fealty. "Lord Malachi," he barked. "You are the finest swordsman of my house. Defend the honor of our laws. Strike down this heretic." A massive vampire, broad as an oak tree and scarred from 100 battles, stepped forward. Malachi was a brute, known for his overwhelming strength. He drew a gargantuan two-handed greatsword, its polished surface reflecting the torchlight. He gave Alaric a grim, joyless smile. "It is a shame, my lord," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "I always respected you. But the law is the law. Then let us see which law is stronger, Malachi," Alaric replied, his voice calm and even. Malachi roared and charged, his great sword scything through the air in an arc designed to cleave Alaric in two. The sheer force of the blow would have shattered the shield of a lesser warrior. Alaric did not meet it. He moved like a whisper of smoke, a fluid, economical sidestep that let the greatsword slam into the stone floor, sending chips of obsidian flying. Before Malachi could recover from his overswing, Alaric was already moving. His movements were not born of brute strength, but of centuries of practice, a deadly, efficient grace. He was not a brawler, he was a duelist, an artist of death. His blade darted forward, not at the armored chest, but at the unarmored gap at Malachi's elbow. The tip of his sword severed the tendons there with surgical precision. Malachi bellowed in pain and rage, his sword arm going limp. The great sword clattered to the floor. He tried to swing with his other arm, a clumsy, backhanded blow. Alaric flowed around him, a shadow in the torchlight. His sword seemed to move of its own accord, a blur of dark steel. It traced a single, fine red line across Malachi's throat. The giant vampire froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. He brought a hand to his neck, and it came away wet with his own lifeblood. He gargled, tried to speak, and then collapsed, his massive body hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. The entire fight had taken less than 10 seconds. A stunned silence fell over the court. They were used to protracted, brawling duels. This was something else entirely. This was an execution, delivered with the cold, detached skill of a master. Alaric stood over the body, his sword held loosely at his side, not even breathing heavily. He had not been fighting for sport or honor. He had been fighting for his daughter's life, and there was no room for anything but lethal efficiency. His gaze lifted, sweeping over the assembled lords, his dark eyes asking a silent question. Who is next? Volkov's face was ashen. He had expected a long, drawn-out battle that would tire Alaric, perhaps even wound him, making him vulnerable for the next challenger. He had not expected this. He had forgotten that before Alaric was a king known for his diplomacy, he had been a warrior who had carved his way to the throne through blood and battle. The twins of House Ravencroft. Volkov snarled, desperate. Challenge him. His proclamation insults your house's legacy. 2 vampires, identical in their lean, predatory grace, stepped forward. They moved in perfect, eerie unison, drawing matching curved blades. They were famous for their synchronized fighting style, a whirlwind of steel that had overwhelmed countless opponents. They circled Alaric, one on each side, their movements a mirror image of each other. Alaric did not turn his head to track them. He stood perfectly still in the center of the circle, his eyes half-lidded, his senses extended. He was listening to the scrape of their boots on the stone, feeling the displacement of air as they moved. To the onlookers, it seemed he was unwary, caught between 2 predators. The twins attacked simultaneously, a perfectly timed pincer movement. Their blades sliced in, aimed to impale him from both front and back. At the last possible second, Alaric dropped. He fell into a low crouch, the twin blades hissing through the air where his chest had been, missing each other by inches. As the twins' momentum carried them past him, Alaric exploded upward. His sword became a blur. It was not a single strike, but 2, delivered so quickly they seemed to be one. An upward slash that caught one twin under the ribs, and a spinning reverse thrust that took the other through the back. The 2 vampires collapsed almost in unison, their synchronized dance ending in a synchronized death. Alaric straightened, his blade dripping. He had not wasted a single movement. There was no flourish, no theatrics. Just the cold, hard geometry of combat. He looked past the bodies of the fallen, his gaze once again finding Lord Volkov. A single drop of dark, vampiric blood fell from the tip of his sword and sizzled on the silver circle. The silence in the hall was now one of dawning terror. They were not watching a duel. They were watching a force of nature. And he was just getting started. The stench of blood, thick and metallic, began to fill the great hall. It clung to the tapestries and settled in the air like a fine, crimson dust. After the fall of the Ravencroft twins, there was a moment of hesitation. No one was eager to be the next to test the king's renewed fury. But Lord Volkov, his face pale and slick with sweat, knew that if the challenges stopped, he would lose. Alaric's proclamation would stand. His own life would likely be forfeit for his treason. "Do you see?" he shrieked, his voice thin and shrill with desperation. "He is a butcher, a tyrant. He murders those who stand for tradition. House Danesti, House Mortain, are you so craven you will let him slaughter the law itself? Attack him. Overwhelm him." Spurred by his words, and perhaps by the collective fear that Alaric, if victorious, would be merciless, for more vampires stepped into the circle. 2 were from House Danesti, heavily armored and wielding morning stars, and 2 from House Mortain, lithe and fast, armed with short swords and daggers. They did not approach him one by one. They had learned from the previous challengers. They spread out, surrounding him, their intent clear, to attack from all sides at once. Alaric's stance shifted. He held his sword in a two-handed grip now, his body coiled like a spring. He was no longer the patient duelist waiting for an opening. He was a predator surrounded, and he would have to become a whirlwind of destruction to survive. The four attacked. The armored warriors swung their spiked morning stars in brutal, crushing arcs, while the faster swordsmen darted in, looking for a gap, their blades flashing like silver needles. For the first time, Alaric was forced onto the defensive. He moved in a tight, controlled circle, his sword a blur of parries. The clang of steel on steel rang through the hall, a chaotic, percussive rhythm. A morning star slammed into the floor where he had been a second before, shattering the stone. A dagger sliced his arm, drawing a line of dark blood. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Lily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, whimpering. Alaric felt the sting of the cut, but ignored it. The pain only served to focus him. He could not afford a battle of attrition. He needed to end this quickly. He parried a sword thrust from his left, using the opponent's momentum to spin him into the path of one of the morning stars. The armored vampire, unable to stop his swing, crushed his own ally's skull with a sickening crunch. One down. Before the remaining three could react to the sudden shift, Alaric exploded into motion. He lunged forward, not at the remaining swordsman, but at the second armored brute. His sword thrust was a piston of dark steel, aimed at the small gap in the helmet's visor. The blade punched through the eye slit with horrifying precision. The vampire gargled and fell backward like a felled tree. Two down. The two remaining challengers, a Danesti and a Mortain, hesitated for a fatal second, their eyes wide with shock at the speed and brutality of Alaric's counterattack. That second was all he needed. He ducked under a wild sword swing from the Mortain, his own blade sweeping low, severing the tendons behind the man's knees. As the swordsman screamed and collapsed, Alaric vaulted over his falling body, his full attention on the last man standing. The final challenger backed away, his face a mask of pure terror. He had come to the circle to uphold the law, to gain favor with a new regime. He had not come to be systematically dismantled by a king possessed by a righteous fury. He dropped his weapon. It clattered on the blood-slicked floor. "I yield," he cried, his voice trembling. "Mercy." Alaric stopped, his sword tip inches from the man's throat. His chest was heaving slightly, his tunic stained with his own blood and that of his enemies. He looked at the terrified vampire, and then his gaze swept the room, meeting the eyes of every lord, every council member. His expression was not triumphant. It was hard, cold, and utterly uncompromising. "There is no mercy for those who would murder a child," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. And with a single, efficient thrust, he ended the final challenger's life. He stood alone in the center of the circle, surrounded by the bodies of the 7 vampires who had dared to challenge his word. The hall was utterly silent, save for the sound of his own breathing and the soft, terrified sobs of his daughter. The initial bloodlust of the crowd had long since evaporated, replaced by a primal, instinctual fear. They were not looking at their king. They were looking at their executioner. They were looking at a father who had just shown them, in the most brutal and undeniable way possible, the lengths to which he would go to protect his family. He had decimated them. He had taken on all comers and had not just defeated them, but annihilated them with a cold fury that stripped away all illusions of a civilized political challenge and exposed the raw, bloody truth beneath. His daughter's life was sacred, and anyone who threatened it would cease to exist. He had turned their law into a weapon and used it to carve a new reality from the flesh and blood of his enemies. The trial was over. He had won. But the final judgment was yet to come. As Alaric stood amidst the carnage, the last drop of blood falling from his sword to complete the grim tableau, the magic in the hall began to shift once more. It was different this time. The first pulse, when Lily had arrived, had been one of inquiry and recognition. This was a wave of confirmation, of absolute power settling into a new form. The silvery light that had emanated from the throne of ashes intensified, flooding the great hall with a cold, ethereal glow. It was not the warm, flickering light of the torches, but something more ancient, more fundamental. The runes carved into the arms and back of the throne began to burn with a brilliant white fire. The air grew heavy, crackling with energy, and a low, resonant hum vibrated up through the stone floor, a sound felt as much as heard. Every vampire in the room, from the lowest guard to the highest lord, felt the immense, primordial power of the kingdom's deepest magic asserting itself. They instinctively bowed their heads, shielding their eyes from the overwhelming light. Only Alaric, Elena, and Lily remained standing, bathed in the throne's radiance. Alaric watched, his breath held, as the ancient runes shifted. The characters, which had been fixed for millennia, seemed to flow like liquid light. He focused on the section that detailed the progenitor's decree, the very law that had condemned his daughter. The rune for purity flickered, wavered, and then dissolved into nothingness. In its place, a new symbol began to form, a complex, interlocking design that Alaric had never seen before. It pulsed with a gentle, steady light, and he understood its meaning with an instinctual certainty that went beyond language. It was the rune for kinship, for belonging. The law had not just been broken, it had been unwritten. The throne itself, the ultimate arbiter of all law and tradition, had accepted his proclamation, sanctified by his victory in the trial. It had absorbed the blood spilled in the circle as a sacrifice and, in return, had forged a new covenant. From this moment forward, the bloodline was not defined by its purity, but by its existence. His daughter was no longer an abomination under the law. She was a recognized heir. The light from the throne coalesced, sending a single, pure beam across the hall. It did not touch Alaric, nor the fallen warriors. It settled gently on Lily, who was still held tight in Elena's arms. The child, who had been crying, fell silent. She looked up, her wide, dark eyes filled with wonder, not fear. The light seemed to embrace her, a soft, protective shimmer that clung to her small form. It was a benediction. An anointing. The magic of the kingdom was claiming her as its own. When the light finally receded, the new rune on the throne glowed with a soft, permanent warmth, and the hall was returned to the flickering torchlight. The oppressive weight of the magic lifted, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. Lord Volkov, who had been cowering near the wall, stared at the transformed throne, his face a ruin of disbelief and utter defeat. His challenge was ashes. His ambition was a joke. He had tried to use the law to seize power, and in doing so, had provoked a force that had shattered that very law. Alaric walked out of the blood-soaked circle, his sword now hanging limp at his side. He did not look at Volkov or any of the other lords. He walked directly to Elena and Lily. He gently took his daughter from her mother's arms, holding her close. He could feel the faint, warm hum of the throne's magic still clinging to her, a protective aura. "It is done," he said softly to Elena, his voice filled with a weariness that was bone-deep, but also with a quiet, fierce joy. "It is over." He turned, his family in his arms, to face his court. His subjects. His gaze was hard as diamonds. "You have borne witness this night," he declared, his voice ringing with renewed authority. "The old way is dead. A new age begins. An age where we will be defined not by the purity of our blood, but by the strength of our bonds." He looked down at Lily, his expression softening into one of pure, unadulterated love. "This is my daughter, Lily, of the line of Cassian. She is the first of the new blood. She is the heir to the throne of ashes." Then, he extended his free hand to Elena, his eyes locking with hers, a silent vow passing between them that was more binding than any words. "And this is Elena. My heart. My queen." He drew her to his side, his arm encircling her, holding his family together in the center of the hall. He had walked into this chamber tonight to face a political challenge, a king defending his reign. He would leave it as something more. A father. A husband. A protector. He had been forced to choose between his crown and his daughter, and in choosing his daughter, he had won them both, and in the process, redefined the meaning of his crown for all time. The lords of the court, one by one, slowly, hesitantly, bent the knee. Not to the king they had known, but to the father who had just burned down their world to build a better one for his child. The hours that followed were a blur of grim necessity. The great hall was cleared, the bodies of the fallen removed with a somber efficiency that belied the seismic shift that had occurred. Lord Volkov and his closest co-conspirators were taken into custody, their treason now undeniable and their fate sealed. The court, cowed and awestruck, dispersed to their chambers to whisper and wonder about the new world they had woken up in. Through it all, Alaric did not let Elena or Lily leave his side. He held his daughter's hand, a constant, grounding pressure, as he gave orders, his voice once again the calm, measured tone of a king, but with an underlying warmth that had never been there before. Finally, when the hall was empty and quiet, save for the royal guards standing sentinel at the doors, he led his family away from the throne room, through winding corridors of black stone, to his private chambers. The rooms were vast and opulent, filled with priceless artifacts and ancient texts, but they felt cold, sterile, and lonely. They were the rooms of a king, not a father. Lily, exhausted by the terror and wonder of the night, had fallen asleep in his arms, her small head resting on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even. He carried her to his own massive bed, a monstrosity of carved ebony and velvet hangings, and laid her down gently in its center. She looked impossibly small against the vast expanse of dark silk. He pulled a heavy, fur-lined blanket over her, his movements careful, almost clumsy, as if he were afraid this fragile reality might break. Elena stood by the hearth, where a fire had been lit, its flames casting a warm, dancing light that fought back the room's inherent gloom. She watched him, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and lingering uncertainty. She had spent 5 years running from this world, from this man, convinced he was a danger to her child. Now, he was their only safety. Alaric walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with 5 years of fear and misunderstanding. "You are hurt," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the bloody tear in his tunic sleeve. "It is nothing," he dismissed. "Let me see," she insisted, her healer's instinct overriding everything else. She stepped forward, her hands tentative at first, then more certain as she gently pushed the torn fabric aside to examine the gash on his arm. It was already beginning to heal, the dark blood scabbing over, but the wound was deep. She went to a basin of water on a nearby table, wet a cloth, and returned to carefully clean the injury. Her touch was as gentle as he remembered, a ghost of a sensation that made his heart ache. "Why did you run, Elena?" he asked, his voice low, not an accusation, but a question heavy with the pain of his long ignorance. "Why did you not come to me?" She finished cleaning the wound, her eyes focused on her task, not meeting his. "You know why," she whispered. "The law. I heard the whispers in your court, even during that 1 week. The talk of purity, the punishment for half-breeds. I knew what they would demand of you, what you would be forced to do. You thought I would let them harm you? Harm our child?" The hurt in his voice was raw. She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I didn't know what you would do. I knew what the king would be required to do. I couldn't put you in that position. I couldn't make you choose between your entire world and a child you didn't even know existed. It would have been your ruin. My leaving, it was the only way I could think of to protect you both." He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear that escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "You protected her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You kept her safe, alone, for 5 years. You have a strength I cannot imagine, Elena. But you were wrong about one thing. Leaving was not protecting me. It was a wound that never healed. I searched for you." "I know," she breathed. "I felt it sometimes. Like a whisper on the wind. I had to learn to shield myself, to hide Lily. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. That life is over," he vowed, his gaze intense. "You will never be afraid again. You will never be alone again." He drew her closer, until her forehead rested against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her with a desperate, tender strength, as if he could physically absorb all the fear and loneliness she had carried for so long. She sagged against him, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief shaking her body, and he just held her, murmuring reassurances, until the storm of pent-up emotion passed. They stood like that for a long time, held together by the warmth of the fire and the quiet breathing of their sleeping daughter. The cold, empty chambers of a king began to feel like a home. Later, Elena sat on the edge of the bed, watching Lily sleep. Alaric came and sat beside her, his presence a solid, comforting weight. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "She has your courage," he said softly, his gaze on his daughter's peaceful face. "She walked into a hall of monsters and was not afraid." "She was looking for her father," Elena replied, a small smile touching her lips. "She said she saw you in a dream." A sad man on a big chair. A wave of emotion washed over Alaric's face, regret, love, a fierce, boundless protectiveness. He looked around the vast, shadowed room, at the trappings of his power, and saw them for what they were, a cage he had built for himself. A cage his fearless little girl had just broken open with a single word. Love had not just conquered tradition, it had obliterated it. A new kingdom would be born from the ashes of the old one, built not on the brittle foundation of purity, but on the unshakable bedrock of a father's love. He looked from his sleeping daughter to the woman by his side, his queen, his healer, his heart. The family he never knew he had, now the center of his entire universe. He was complete. And he would protect this precious, impossible peace with every last breath he had. The king was dead. Long live the father.